Hi, this is Heather Jerome from heatherjerome.ca and from the Sonatas and Partitas.com. This video is a video about the Andante BWV 1003 in C major. Now, in my experience with the Sonatas and Partitas, there are two types of pieces. There are the hard pieces and the deceptively simple pieces. And like a student of mine told me when he was first learning this piece, he thought it was so easy it felt like he was in clown school. And then as he got along in it further and further, he just felt like he didn't know where he was in the world. And honestly, that was a little bit my experience with it also. So I'd like to make a few tutorial videos about this piece. And in this one, I'd like to discuss how Bach would have related to this piece as a study for the violin. As we mentioned in the critical notes of our book, Carl Philipp Emanuel, Bach's son, wrote that his father understood to perfection the possibilities of all stringed instruments. And he said that one of the greatest violinists once told him that he had seen nothing more perfect for learning to be a good violinist and could suggest nothing better to anyone eager to learn than the said violin solos without bass. So what aspect of violin playing does this piece cover? I mean, it's a simple little piece with a simple melody and a little bass accompaniment. Now, saying that this is a simple piece, it's actually easy for a guitarist to say that because in a way, at least on the surface, it's a simple piece for guitarists. But there is actually nothing else like that in all the violin literature. At least I don't think there was at the time that this Andante was composed. It's definitely not typical of violin writing, I'll tell you that. All the other music in the Sonatas and Partitas does have a bass line, but that bass line is fractured. Some of the times there are notes that are implied. Sometimes there's a note that might be transposed into a different octave. But in this Andante, the bass line is fully and completely there, and it moves in steady eighth notes throughout. Now this brings me to something else we mentioned in the performance notes of our book. We said that Bach wrote the Sonatas and Partitas not only as studies for the violin, but that we can also see that he continuously challenged himself as a composer. And this seemingly simple aria with a walking bass is a case in point. Now, myself as a teacher who always insists that my students develop their ear as well as their guitar chops, I was delighted to see that this piece could be used as a study in interval identification. And in the first phrase, Bach uses almost every interval once. Some of them are repeated, but not many. So we start with a third, and then a fourth, a second, a sixth, a tritone, a seventh. Now all these intervals, in a sense, have meaning. Like the third is just very sweet and grounded, and the fourth, I always think of the fourth as like that's the interval I would never want to meet in a dark alley. There's just something kind of rough about it. And then resolves to a third, and then a second. The second, I call that the shimmer interval. It's got a shimmer too. And then a sixth. I think in Bach's day that the interval of the sixth signified heaven. And then the tritone, that was the devil's interval. And then a seventh, oh, raunchy. And so on. So I think that it's a really good exercise, first of all, to play it and just really relate to those intervals and listen to the different qualities of them as it just kind of gently shifts from one interval to another. But coming back to the violin, why would Bach write an interval study for violinists? I mean, I don't even know if they had interval identification back then, although I suppose they did, since intervals were basically the backbone of their composition. But I think that me thinking of it in this terms, I might have got a little bit waylaid being a guitarist. But the thing about a violin study with all these carefully sequential intervals is I think it's a study in intonation. Now, we need to take a step aside here for a short discussion of something that's actually extensively covered on the internet. So I do suggest that if what I'm saying is new to you, you could do some more reading up on it on your own. But basically, when it comes to playing in tune, there are 3 words that we can all use, but they have slightly different meanings. So one of them is tuning, another is intonation, and the last one is temperament. Now, working backwards in that list of terms, temperament refers to the way that the octave is divided into 12 semitones. So here we have an octave, and then there's the 12 frets in between. And where those frets are placed, that's called temperament. And there are actually choices as to where those frets would be placed. Now on the guitar, they're all equally spaced, not physically equally, but in sound, the distance from one fret to another, that's a semitone, and the semitones all sound the same on the guitar. And that temperament is called equal temperament. Most people take it for granted now, but actually in Bach's time, equal temperament, people knew about it, but it wasn't the standard. And as far as I could read back then, most people hated it. But equal temperament fought long and hard and won. And it's thanks to equal temperament that music could develop like it did in the classical and the Romantic period. But now that we're moving away from Romanticism so much, people are also moving away from equal temperament. But the point is that is temperament. Okay, so now I said that the 12 frets are equally spaced, and what I said was that there are choices. So just bear with me, I'm going to do a tiny bit of math here. Because the thing that we have to explain is those choices. Now, the open string, let's say the open string is 1 foot long, which it's not, but let's just say it is. And then we're going to play a note an octave higher. Well, the remaining part from our finger to the end is going to be a 1/2 foot long. And it's going to vibrate twice as fast. So if the open string vibrates 100 times per second, this one, now the string vibrates 200 times per second. That's what happens when you make it shorter. It vibrates at different speeds and it makes a different notes. Now let's say we want to go up 5 notes. That's going up a 5th. E, F, G, A, B. Now we're a 5th up. So now this fret is placed here and it's giving us this sound. But if we play the harmonic, we actually have to put our finger to play the harmonic if you want it really clear. You have to actually play it a tiny, tiny bit above the fret, like sharper than the fret. And that fret is actually a tiny, tiny bit flat compared to the harmonic. And the note is a tiny, tiny bit lower. And that's the choice of equal temperament, is that the 5th, the note 5 notes above the open string, happens to be a tiny bit flat compared to what's called just intonation. So intonation is like tuning within a temperament. So this note is in tune in equal temperament, but it's not in tune in just intonation, and it is not in tune in the temperament that they used in Bach's day. Now the 5th is just very, very slightly different. Like a lot of people can't even hear that difference. But in Bach's day they could, because our ears are used to equal temperament, so we don't even notice it. But one of them that's easier to notice is the 3rd. Now the 5th is flat, but the 3rd is sharp, and it's quite sharp. Have to turn it down about that much. There, that's more of a pure 3rd. And a pure 3rd is much warmer than a tempered 3rd. And that's one of the reasons that they didn't like equal temperament, because the 3rds and 6ths were pretty off compared to pure tuning, and their world revolved around 3rds and 6ths. But why bother make it flat? Why not put the fret at the right place? Well, the reason is, and I have to say, I think Pythagoras would have had to behead me for showing you this. But music isn't perfect. And the way it's not perfect is that to make this harmonic sound nice and clear like that, I need to put my finger exactly 1/3 of the way along the string's length. So there's 1/3 of the string left here, and there are 2/3 left on this side. And another way to say that is to go up a fifth. The ratio is 2 to 3. And let's say we're back at our string vibrating. The open string vibrates 100 times a second. Well, half of that is 50, and 3 times 50 is 150. So 2/3, that's 150 times per second. Now, just to punch in all the math really fast, let's say we just keep going up an octave with all these E's, and then start on the open E and just keep going up 5 notes every time until we get back up to the same E. If you look at the math, you'll see that when you go up 5, up 5, up 5, up 5, you end up with a note that's actually higher, more vibrations per second than if you go up an octave at a time. And that's just the way that it is. It just doesn't work. And so this battle for temperament went on for centuries. And now people use different temperaments, but equal temperament is the one that kind of stuck and that most people are familiar with now. So coming back to the idea of this being an intonation study for violinists, on the guitar, we don't have a choice. Our frets are where they are, and that's where our fingers land. I mean, we could, for example, when we're playing this, we could push that string in a little bit and make it flatter, but I think trying to micro-tune all these intervals with pushing and pulling the strings can pretty much only lead to disaster. But violinists can place their fingers at a slightly different place, and they can really tune each one of those intervals. Now, something that's so obvious that it probably doesn't need to be said, but it's so important it probably should be said, is that the best way to tune is to play 2 notes at once. So that sounds like an in-tune octave to me. But if I just go, it's harder to tell. And so Bach has this study where he's got all these double stops for the violin. Now, as guitarists, we can also really become attuned to this beautiful like shifting of sonorities and shifting of qualities of the intervals. You know, like what's a 6? Why did they say the 6 was like the interval of heaven? Well, it's just such a pure kind of broad feeling interval. And then the tritone, why is that the devil's interval? Well, it's pretty twangy. It was illegal to play that in church for many centuries. But, you know, as guitarists and people nowadays, we don't really relate to those different qualities of the interval so much. But in this piece, you can really listen closely and really feel them as they just like gradually shift from one to the other and under this beautiful melody and bass accompaniment. So I hope you found this helpful. If you'd like to get a copy of our arrangement, you can get it at the website sonatasandpartitas.com. If you'd like to find out when new videos are uploaded, you can subscribe to the channel here, turn on your notifications, or else you can also subscribe to our non-promotional newsletter at sonatasandpartitas.com.